Good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily. Daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. One of the all-time great Georgia Bulldogs has said something very interesting about the current team that we're about to see on the field starting next Saturday. That, to me, feels like a pretty good place to start in terms of how exactly it's going to look for UGA here today. Also, I am going to give the most optimistic assessment possible for Georgia today. I think that's – you at least have to consider the possibility this could be true, so we'll do that over the course of our time. Mike Griffith stops by. A lot of interesting stuff around the SEC today. We'll have some fun with that. And really kind of a cool day coming up in Athens today. We're going to hear from Georgia coach Kirby Smart. Expected to hear from Mikhail Williams, who may be one of the best players in the entire country. Dominic Lovett, get a chance to hear from him. Brand new Georgia starting quarterback Carson Beck. Boy, going to hear a lot today coming out of Athens. So next couple of days on our show will be fun, unpacking a lot of that. So it's a busy show. You would expect that this time of year. A lot going on as it relates to football. We are so happy to have you with us for it there as well. So what do you say we go ahead and get it started? It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA Athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
You know, every team in every season kind of brings its own personality. And I think some of the curiosity for those of us who are fans or watch this stuff closely as media, whatever else, I think the curiosity about a brand new year is sort of the thought of, well, what will this particular team look like? Obviously, we're referencing the Georgia team in 2023, which begins its quest to go for 3-23 next Saturday when it starts against Tennessee Martin. It'll get more interesting after that, but our first glimpse of all of this is next Saturday. And we're led to believe that some things will be as Georgia as they've ever been. And in some respects, there could be some aspects of this particular Georgia team that are just a little bit different than we've kind of gotten used to. Different, not necessarily good or bad, just different. It may just look a little bit different. And with that in mind, I thought it was really interesting to hear this week from the great former Georgia Bulldog, one of the best players in the history of this program network, kind of a growing star over there in the ESPN world. He's got his own podcast talking about college football. And on that particular show that McElroy recently did, McElroy was having David Pollack with the idea that a good bit different. I want you to hear David Pollack on with Greg McElroy from the McElroy's ESPN podcast about why Georgia's going to look different this year defensively than it has in maybe either of its last two national championship seasons in 2021 and 22. This is David Pollack this week with Greg McElroy.
I do think this defense will be built a little bit different. I think when you saw this defense in the past, I think they could really get a lot of pressure from the interior. I think Mikhail Williams and company are going to be better on the outside. I think they'll have better pass rushers on the outside. I think they've recruited different types of body types now that will fit in interesting, that will be fun to watch it morph and change. But you're absolutely right. But you know what? When I go and I see these guys at practice and when I really look at them, there's so many good-looking bodies. And there's so many guys that they can rotate. While they're not going to beat Jalen Carter. And listen, another thing, Bear Alexander left to USC. He got who when you turn on the tape, you could see the flashes and the pass rush ability was really, really good. But a guy you mentioned like Stackhouse is a great guy to mention. He's like a 3-star, 4-star guy, 4-star guy that got recruited that you've seen develop. When I go and I watch those defensive guys along the front, they're all like that. I think they're all guys that have now been seasoned for several years. There's very few puppies that are going to play. A lot of guys with a lot of experience that I think will come in. And we know the system's really, really good.
So what David Pollack is saying there on with Greg McElroy is not negative about Georgia in any way at all. It's just an evaluation that this year's team's going to look different, that the pass rush that you want more likely to come from the outside maybe than it has before. Now, some of that's because Jalen Carter's not here anymore. And Jalen Carter, I believe, as a rookie in the National Football League, is going to prove himself probably right away of being a truly dominant interior pass rushing force. I think it's hard to kind of put into words exactly how effective Carter was for UGA over the course of the last couple of years. Even on that team in 2021, in which Carter was a little younger, and you had, 3 defensive linemen who would be taken in the next NFL draft immediately after that season, I think you can probably say that Carter was still the most overall talented player among that group. And it's not a huge leap to say of the last 2 national championship teams for Georgia that Carter overall has been the most talented player to play at Georgia over the course of these last couple of seasons. Maybe Brock Bowers on the other side of the ball gives him a run for his money, but you can make a pretty strong case that Jalen Carter has been the most talented player at Georgia over the course of the last couple of years. He's gone. The interior pass rush that he brought to the table, that's sort of gone too. And so what David Pollack says, okay, well, if you're looking for that kind of havoc to be wreaked on defense, then don't look inside as much as you may would have in the past. Because if you think about it, go back to 2021 when Dan Lanning was here still as defensive coordinator. When Georgia dialed up pressure, when they sent the extra pass rusher, oftentimes where did it come from? Came from the middle there as well. Lanning loved kind of sending those inside linebackers in blitz situations, sending them after the quarterback. That was always one of the areas in which Georgia was so dangerous. And David Pollack says now when you are looking for that Georgia pass rush, look to the outside a little bit more. Look to Mikael Williams, who will be a defensive end. Look to the outside linebackers, guys like Marvin Jones Jr. going into his second year. I believe he's now fully healthy. I believe he's ready to possibly explode onto the scene. Look for pass rush to come from traditional pass rush spots on the edge of the defense. That's why I call these guys edge defenders. Some of them are defensive ends. Some of them are outside linebackers. But that's traditionally speaking in football where the pass rush comes from. From Georgia, for a multitude of reasons, that hasn't always been the case. But this year, David Pollack says you may get a little bit more of a conventional pass rush from Georgia where dominant players on the edge, on the outside of this defense, they're being asked to get to the quarterback more because the personality on the interior of this defense is just a little bit different. As I said before, David Pollack in no way means that as a negative against UGA, but it does speak to, I guess, a little bit of a concern that Kirby Smart has perhaps had for his defensive line. And you can't help but have some of this going on when you don't have Jalen Carter here anymore. And listen, you got to be honest about this as well. If Bear Alexander was still at Georgia, had he not transferred to USC, that's the sort of athletic defensive lineman that Georgia would have had a very high use for. And you can say what you want about Bear's personality and maybe some of the things that led him to go to USC and, what that possibly says about Alexander. That's a fair conversation to have, I believe. But that doesn't change the fact that if Alexander was still here, he would be a part of the story for the Georgia defensive line. So Carter's departure, Alexander's absence, some of the other things that have gone on here have created a scenario where Kirby Smart is probably at least a little bit concerned about his defensive line, possibly not because of the inability of the players who play there, but the overall importance of the position to the overall success formula for Georgia, if you get my drift about that. In other words, this may not be a bad defensive line, but defensive line is so important that you've got to be as good there as you possibly can be. So with that in mind, and in light of what David Pollack was just saying, let's go back to last Saturday for Kirby Smart. Asked about the overall depth of the Georgia defensive line, and Smart didn't hold back with his belief that there are some concerns there about exactly how much depth Georgia has with the defensive line that David Pollack says is going to cause Georgia to do some things maybe different defensively this year than it's done in the past. This is Kirby Smart's take on that subject going back to Saturday.
Yeah, we're not as deep as we've been. We don't have the depth that we probably have had. Maybe that's a luxury compared to other people for WAPs. So
Smart says an important thing there. He basically alludes to the fact that our definition of not enough depth may still be considered a luxury, having what Kirby Smart thinks is enough depth in its overall defensive line, because Georgia probably still has more talented players along its defensive line than any other team in the country. More on that in a moment, by the way. But it does kind of speak to, but how good and how effective can these players be? A top 10 pick like Jalen Carter is no longer here. We're 2 years removed from 3 first-round picks no longer being a part of this group. A guy like Bear Alexander had the very high recruiting profile. He's now gone. He's transferred to USC. More glory, more individual attention, but he's gone nonetheless. Guys like Jordan Hall and others are, maybe Jamal Jarrett, they're waiting to kind of grow into a bigger role right now. They've got to hit the ground running and go through some growing pains and and get ready to be contributors. So in the midst of all of that, you've got good, effective players like Zion Logue and Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson, who have kind of waited their turn to have more responsibility, waited their turn to have a bigger spotlight on them. And there are legitimately going to be questions anytime players like that step into larger roles. But while those questions are fair to ask, the guys who will be occupying those positions and occupying those spots are quite confident in their own ability to step up and do just that. I thought that Warren Brinson, which I guess was his first media appearance as a Georgia player, I thought that Warren Brinson had some very interesting things to say yesterday. And obviously, as you would imagine, guys like Brinson, they've got the confidence that they can more than step in and fill in for what Carter would have provided last year, the other guys would have provided in 2021. Guys like Brinson feel like this can be their time to do just that, and apparently it's not just Warren Brinson who feels that way. It's Georgia defensive line coach Trey Scott who is instilling that belief in his own players. You know, the idea that this group here this year, defensive tackles in particular, can carry on the legacy of what's become a dominant group for the Dogs. Warren Brinson had some great stuff to say about that yesterday. Let me let you hear a little bit of Brinson on that topic.
We have a motto in our room. Coach Scott always preaches that we all we got, we all we need. We know it's gonna be a journey this season to work hard, to fill up the roles, to be able to push through and sustain throughout this whole season. So it's just us putting forth our best foot to work hard and sustain and taking care of our bodies.
Kirby Smart says not quite so sure about the depth for this group here right now. Warren Brinson, not a clapback on Kirby, but just sort of a response to the general topic, says, hey, our coach Trey Scott says all we've got's all we need. We're going to be ready to go later on in that same media availability. Brinson kind of talked about the notion that maybe Georgia doesn't have enough, whatever the phrase is, game wreckers or whatever else. Brinson says he still thinks that Georgia's going to have plenty on that. It's worth going to the DawgNation YouTube page to watch the full press conference with Warren yesterday for yourself. I think it'll be very much worth your time. Now, let me kind of finish up this conversation by saying this, that if you want to go back to David Pollack's words a little earlier, I think this is important. What Pollack is essentially describing is a traditional defense. You know, last year, a guy like Jalen Carter was a very untraditional, non-traditional player. You don't typically see defensive tackles who are that dominant changing the game from the interior position like that. That's just kind of a rare thing to see. That's how talented Carter was, truly a rare breed indeed. This year's Georgia defense may be a little bit more traditional, where the kind of stats and the glory, the individual attention, that may rest where in football it oftentimes does, with the players playing on kind of the outside edge of the defense, defensive end, outside linebacker, which means the defensive tackles, the guys on the interior of that defense, they're still going to have a very important role, but it may not be the starring role that a guy like Carter had a year ago. But it's no less important for UGA. I want to give you a couple of stats to kind of sort of put a point on this point. If you go back and look the last 2 years for Georgia, national championship teams, national championship defenses, what's the one thing that Georgia has been across the board undeniably stellar in each and every one of those 2 seasons? It probably doesn't always get enough credit. Georgia essentially didn't yield anything on the ground. When it comes to rushing yards, something that feels a little bit like an unsexy topic in a day and age in which quarterbacks and wide receivers seem to dominate so much of the chatter, Georgia has taken away an offensive weapon from every team that it's played, and it's done so before the game even begins. Last year, Georgia was first in the nation in yards per game allowed on the ground. They were third in the nation in yards per rushing play allowed. That's a dominant defensive performance against the run, and it still matters. Go back to 2021. Georgia was second in the nation in yards per game allowed on the ground and second in the nation in yards. Georgia's only given up a total of 10 rushing touchdowns in the last 2 years. That's the job of this Georgia defensive line here this year. It's not necessarily their job to be Jalen Carter. I'm sure it'd be cool if one of them did kind of emerge as an interior pass rusher. But Georgia's ultimate job, Georgia's prime directive when it comes to its defensive linemen up front, is to take away the run. Because if you take away the run, if you dissuade coaches from even calling rushing plays because you know it's not going to work against Georgia, then as Kirby Smart has explained in the past, all of a sudden stopping the pass game becomes much easier to do. All of a sudden you can drop guys back into coverage, you can send them after quarterbacks, you can do whatever you want to because you have taken away one of the legs of the opponent that you're trying to fight against. That's what the Georgia defensive line has done the last couple of years. When it comes to Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson and Zion Logue and all the guys who'll be asked to be rotational players, providing that for Georgia again, my guess is those dudes are going to be more than equal to the task. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily. It's the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans presented by Breda Pest Management, and we're happy to have you with us. No matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., across all platforms. Before that, 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app. Extra content for those who consume the show on our own platform. Of course, we're on the radio in the afternoon and across all podcast platforms there as well. Whatever platform you choose to use, just thanks for using it. And a big thanks to our friends at Breda Pest Management who make it all possible. You know, Matt Breda and his entire team, they were with us this past weekend for high school football. Will be with us throughout the season there as well. And that's the dedication they have to kind of our local community and the sports world. Just good folks who kind of understand the way in which high school sports like that can be kind of a epicenter for communities, sort of that kind of, you know, sort of cultural touchstone that everybody kind of gathers around. And that's what Breda Pest Management is a part of there as well. In business since 1975, 125 employees, taking care of families who are out running around and doing sports and living life and doing things like that. And when you're out doing all those things, the last thing you want to think about are termites or bugs or critters. And gosh, sometimes we get these crazy, critters around the house, flying squirrels, things like that. Well, listen, you don't want to think about that. You're too busy enjoying your life. But Breda Pest Management thinks about that. And the dedication they've shown to kind of conquering those problems has gotten them a whole bunch of accolades. They've now been recognized as the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics. That means Sanford Stadium, all the athletic venues in Athens, there on the UGA campus, all taken care of and protected by our friends at Breda Pest Management. And that same level of protection, that same level of service that Breda gives to UGA, they can give to you as well. And not only is it kind of a cool piece of bragging rights to say, hey, my pest control company is the same as UGA's, not only that, the institutional strength that Breda's established can be leveraged for your benefit by putting more money in your pocket. You will save instantly just for making the decision. Put more money back in your pocket when you make that switch to Breda Pest Management for your termite protection and your pest control provision. So please find them online. It's BredaPest.com. Let's make sure we have that website, BredaPest.com, B-R-E-D-A, BredaPest.com. Make sure you get that today, BredaPest.com for more on that, B-R-E-D-A, BredaPest.com. All right, so coming up here in a moment, we're going to hear from Mike Griffith. It's going to be a fun conversation with Mike. He's been in Athens, obviously watching all the proceedings closely as Georgia closes out its fall camp, gets ready to begin the upcoming season, naming a starting quarterback, putting some pieces together, healing up some injuries. We'll cover a lot of that ground with Mike Griffith here coming up in just a moment. Also, the first big college football game of the season is next Thursday. And there are a handful of games here this weekend. We're pretty excited about those. We'll probably talk more about those tomorrow. We're fairly excited about seeing Vandy in action and USC and Notre Dame. We're fairly interested in that. But what's going to happen next week, starting with Utah, Florida on Thursday night's far more interesting. There's a lot of movement, a lot of projection changes, if you will, with that Florida-Utah game. We'll get to that here coming up in just a little bit. Prior to that, though, I want to go around the DawgHouse. And it's poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream, and we're happy to have them as a part of Around the DawgHouse. And I want to be very, I guess the word is like grandiose. I want to give you the most optimistic assessment for Georgia possible. And I want to call upon one of the all-time great teams in sports to sort of help me do that. Now, let me also kind of explain this further. Yesterday, we tried to give the most realistic assessment for Georgia possible. And we talked about the Brian Kelly phrasing around the game against Missouri where Georgia played like, he said a different word, I'll say garbage. Georgia played like garbage, yet they still found a way to win. And what I told all of you yesterday, and this remains no less true, that what Kelly described there is likely going to happen again this year too, where at some point in time, over the course of a long regular season, even though Georgia on paper stands to be a sizable favorite in every game, in all likelihood, some game like Missouri is going to pop up at some point in time, and you can't necessarily predict what it's going to be, because if you could predict what it's going to be, it wouldn't be like Missouri a year ago that came out of nowhere. Some sort of weird adversity is likely to strike out of nowhere, and Georgia's championship medal will be tested how it responds to that in that particular moment. That's just sort of the way that college football goes. Math is a funny thing. Georgia has about a 90% chance of winning, 10 or 11 of its regular season games, at least a 75% chance of winning all of its games, and yet its chances of winning all those games is still only about 21, 22%. Math is just sort of a funny thing when you get into the overall analytics. You may be an overwhelming favorite to win each game, but that doesn't add up to an overwhelming favorite to win all the games. College football is just tricky in that regard. And for Georgia, that it's likely true, but it's not guaranteed to be true. There is also a chance here that Georgia is, you at least have to consider this as a possibility, that Georgia is just more dominant than anything that we've seen ever in college football history. And I'm reminded of something that Kirby Smart said back in July on the idea of Georgia going for, as we say around here, go for 3-23. Minnesota did this way back in the 1930s, but nobody really cares about that. No one really even knows anything about that, nor do they really care to learn anything about it. It's just something that happened almost a century ago, almost totally irrelevant. And so what Kirby Smart has said is, okay, when it comes to our players, if they're not that motivated by what the Golden Gophers did back before any of us were born, most of our parents weren't even born, if that's not particularly relevant for Georgia, then what about something they may have heard of? A lot of these players have seen The Last Dance. That was the documentary that was very popular a couple of years ago. They know about Michael Jordan. If they're smart, they recognize him as the one true GOAT. And because of that, these players might care a little bit more about the three-peat, the 3 straight championships that the Bulls put together over the course of 2 different eras there in Chicago for Michael Jordan. And Kirby Smart kind of talked about that back in July, and I think what he said then is relevant for us today. Let's hear Kirby on that from a few weeks ago as a way of kind of setting us up for the next phase of our conversation today. Here's Kirby.
We've certainly looked at some three-peat scenarios of teams like the Bulls and different sports teams that they might actually know about. No offense to the Minnesota 1935 team, but I don't know if it's going to resonate with my audience. So we're going to try to, I don't care about the three-peat, the two-peat, or the one-peat. I care about complacency. And if the focus is on that and outcomes, I think the rest will take care of itself in terms of allowing our guys to focus on being the best they can be.
So the point that I'm getting to is this. If you go back and look at that era of the Bulls, especially that second era of the three-peat, the second three-peat they put together, one of those teams won 70-something games, 70-something games in an 82-game season. They were just unquestionably, undeniably dominant, arguably in the very, very short list of the best single-season teams in the history of sports. And those kinds of like single-season levels of dominance don't come around very much, but they do come around. And y'all, I think those of us who are Georgia fans, now the Georgia coaches and players, they can't really talk like this because, they got, win the day or whatever the phrasing is for this particular year. But there's no reason why we can't be honest about this. That while college football has not gotten easier overnight, not easier to predict, not easier to navigate, there is also a chance that this is just a Georgia team that kind of stands far above anything we've ever seen in the past. It is not statistically likely this is true, but it is statistically possible that Georgia could be a team on par with what the Bulls would have been in the 1990s. Was it the 97 team that won the 70-something games? I forget which one of those 3 years they won the 70-plus games, but you're talking about a single-season level of dominance unlike really anything that had ever been seen in any kind of modern time in sports. And Georgia could be ready to do that again. Now, if you don't believe me, let's talk about the evidence we have in front of us. The other day, once again, to go back to SEC Media Days, when the All-SEC team was announced by the media back in July, Georgia had 9 players on the All-SEC first team. 9 players. And yesterday, the coaches had their turn at bat on this. They announced their own All-SEC team. And this time, Georgia had 10 players on the All-SEC list. In fact, I want to show you this on the screen here for a moment. You'll see all of the total All-SEC selections. Dogs placing 14 on there, but 10 of those are on the first team alone. And by the way, Georgia kind of crying poor about, we don't have enough depth along the defensive line. Guys like Nazir Stackhouse are expected to be first-team All-SEC defensive line here. So, kind of keep that in mind just for a moment. That whatever depth concerns you might have about Georgia on the defensive line, you're still included guys projected to be first-team All-SEC there. So, once again, very few of Georgia's rivals going to be crying poor on all of that as it relates to Georgia. But that's a different point for a different day. The main point here right now is I'm going to tell you something that you perhaps have heard me say before. If that's true, if Georgia has 10 first-team All-SEC players, there's no point in even playing this season. The results of the games won't even be close. And I'm not talking about the overmatched non-conference schedule or the uninspiring regular season schedule. I'm talking about the whole shooting match. If Georgia has 10 first-team All-SEC players, this season will be one of the most dominant runs towards another national championship ever seen, and Georgia will put the finishing touches on the most successful 3-year stint of any program in the history of the sport. Now, college football is not designed to be that easy, so perhaps it won't be that easy for Georgia either. But if they have 10 first-team All-SEC players, it will. and you say, well, I don't know that I necessarily think they will have 10, or I don't know that I necessarily think they will have what the media says they'll have and have 9. Okay, if they come even close to having that, because keep in mind, previous Georgia teams the last 2 years have had somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 or 5, right? You're talking about this team potentially having essentially double the number of first-team All-SEC type players, which is also a projection in many cases. First-team All-SEC typically equates to being future first-round draft pick. You're talking about Georgia essentially having almost double the future NFL draft capital on this team that would have been seen at high levels in the 2021 and 2022 team. So I'm not saying you should take this projection and take it to the bank, or you should formulate your own opinion around it. Here's all I'm saying. Just consider the possibility of, what if this is true? What if Georgia does have something close to 10 first-team All-SEC players, or as the media said, 9 first-team All-SEC players? If some version of that is even close to being true, then this season for Georgia is going to be something to behold. And that is around the DawgHouse. And it's poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream. Now, Dr. Pepper is also something for me to behold because I love it. And as soon as our show's done today, and this is true for me every single day, race to the fridge, pull out a Dr. Pepper, feel like I've earned it after hopefully a good show. Sit back and relax and enjoy that. And when you do the same thing, I want you to give the brand new flavor offering from Dr. Pepper a try. I'm talking about Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream and Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream Zero Sugar. This is an awesome new choice when you're looking at Dr. Pepper and when you're going to shopping at your local Kroger or wherever you're doing your grocery shopping. You're going to see Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream, Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream Zero Sugar. I hope you'll try it. It's a permanent flavor offering. Anytime Dr. Pepper introduces a new beverage flavor like this, it's always a really big deal, and this has already been treated as a very big deal. Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream, Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream Zero Sugar. Happy to have them bringing Around the DawgHouse to us here today, and tomorrow get a chance to hang out with the folks from Dr. Pepper a little bit, which I'm very excited about. So looking forward to that, and looking forward every day to having a little Dr. Pepper around here and some Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream and Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream Zero Sugar. All right, we're going to keep the Georgia conversation going here right now. Before we're done, there was news yesterday as relates to a 5-star prospect. Now, I'm not talking about Julian Lewis, although I guess we'll squeeze that in here too. There is some criticism today for how one major entity has treated one of Georgia's SEC rivals, the biggest rival of them all. We will join in on that criticism. So we'll give you all of that here coming up before we're done. But for now, all SEC team dominated by Georgia players, the conclusion to Georgia's fall camp, the start of the, I guess you'll call them preseason practices with the games kicking off next Saturday. Let's cover all of that ground here with Mike Griffith as we do a Georgia Farm Bureau practice report with him here on DawgNation Daily today.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Welcome in, Mike Griffith here for a Georgia Farm Bureau practice report on DawgNation Daily here today. And Mike, before you joined us, I was talking about the 10 Georgia players on the first team All-SEC, courtesy of the coaches yesterday. You media folks gave them 9 first-team selections just a few weeks ago. And the point that I made, Mike, is that college football didn't magically get easy overnight. It's not easy to predict, nor is it easy to navigate a season. But if Georgia really does have 10 first-team All-SEC players, then this season will be easy. They will march untouched towards a national championship, and it'll likely be the most dominant single-season team we've ever seen. That is a gigantic projection for Georgia. Frankly, if even a portion of that comes true, if they even come close to matching that from a first-team All-SEC total, then we're talking about a real sight to behold here starting in a couple of weeks. What did you make of all the SEC love for Georgia players once again on that All-SEC team that was released yesterday?
Well, I mean, it's something where we're used to seeing Alabama get those sort of accolades. I think even last year, Brandon, if you go back and look, Alabama had a lot of first-team guys, and now the expectations are here, you know, and to your point, a lot of people do expect Georgia to win a national championship. You know, I had Chris Doring on DawgNation, one of our DawgNation channels earlier this week, and he predicted a three-peat. Former Florida guy talking big stuff about Georgia. So I think it's a lot based off of last year, honestly. To your point, I think you said projection. That's what it is. But Kirby Smart has earned that respect, and a lot of these players have earned that respect where a lot of people expect them to come back and be the best once again.
Of the names you kind of see in that All-SEC conversation, what's interesting to you, I guess? A guy that you absolutely think, should be there, or a guy that's maybe not on there that you think can be a part of that discussion by the end of the year? Of the individual names themselves, what's interesting to you right now?
Well, I mean, it's pretty much the same stuff we canvassed with the All-American team, right? I mean, we had how many guys that made first-team All-American, just a staggering number. I mean, it's good to see Ladd McConkey, continue to get recognition, in my opinion. This is a guy I don't think anybody ever thought was going to be an All-SEC performer, and he is, whether you think he's a first-teamer or a second-teamer. He's become something. Some of these guys weren't supposed to, 5 stars like Malachi Starks, okay, we expected that. Michael Williams, we knew coming in. But you see guys that maybe weren't projected as 5 stars that continue to grow in the Georgia program, and just the way that Kirby Smart has developed talent. I think it's interesting, though, of all the positions, we're not talking about running back. This is supposed to be RBU, and we're not talking about running back. So it's interesting, how Georgia has kind of gotten away from RBU and, become known for other things.
Yeah, they've certainly thrown it better the last couple of years, and that obviously contributes to that. And I guess the more optimistic appraisal of the potential running game for this year, and I certainly agree with you that it's probably the number one concern for Georgia right now, some of that injury related, some of that just curiosity about what you may see from the players on the field. But the one thing I do feel quite confident in, I think the All-SEC team reflects this, I think this is going to be a very good Georgia offensive line. I think that's an underrated aspect of the last 2 national championship teams. Now, whether the Joe Moore Award will ever get around to giving them the award, I don't know. But if the Georgia offensive line is as good as I think it can be, as good as this preseason All-SEC projection once again suggests that it will be, then hard for me to imagine the rushing game won't benefit from that. Will this be 2017 or 2018? No, probably not. But will it be enough to get the job done? If the offensive line is this good, that certainly helps in that cause.
Oh, there's no question. And, as for the Joe Moore, it's a regional bias. You look at the voters, and so many of those guys are former Big Ten guys. I mean, Colt Kubelik did everything but say he voted for Jordan. He's not allowed to reveal his vote, but he only has one. But, I mean, his SEC guy oversees it, but he's only one vote. And I think he's been frustrated, with the panel being so many Big Ten guys. So, there's always inherent issues with award committees. We've talked about Heisman Trophy votes in the past and different biases in different regions and things like that. To me, that's an issue with the Joe Moore. It's a great award, but the award committee is definitely made up of a lot of people from the Midwest, and that's why Michigan, continues to kind of get to. And I think they ought to wait till after the season. But dialing it back to what you said, I mean, gosh, I asked Marius yesterday, Marius Mims, just how big is he now? 6'8", 335, Brandon. 6'8", 335 with 17% body fat. I don't know if there's been a guy that's ever looked the part of a offensive tackle better, and he's so athletic. I mean, just what a mod. Can you imagine lining up across from this Georgia offensive line? I mean, even Warren Brinson, was talking about how this offensive line, wins every scrimmage. Or, I mean, don't think he used those exact words, but he made it very clear how much respect the D-line had. And I said, oh, my goodness. How things have changed. He had 5 first-rounders on that defensive line over the last couple of years. And, now this offensive – the only thing I'll say that concerns me a little bit about all this is looking at the schedule. When are we really going to know, Brandon? Like, when are we really going to know how – I mean, of course the defensive line will look good in September. Of course it will. Of course the running game will look good in September. Carson Beck will look good in September. But when are we really going to know how good this Georgia team is?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've all had our turn kind of talking about the regular season schedule for Georgia. And when you think about you get to November, if you want to talk about, defensive line, rush defense, what Quinjon Judkins, brings in with Ole Miss, obviously stopping Tennessee, running or throwing's, I guess, a big challenge. But I would put myself in the camp of, I think the South Carolina game in September is more interesting than it's given credit for. And I don't think South Carolina is good enough to keep it close with Georgia, but I think it's a more interesting game than it's given credit for, especially if the Gamecocks were to beat North Carolina in week 1, something they could do. I believe the Auburn game, I've been talking about this for months now. I believe that big road test in September, I also think that's a more interesting challenge. I guess in a roundabout way, Mike, here is where I am on the Georgia schedule right now. I think by the time Georgia plays Ole Miss and Tennessee, there is a very good chance that neither of those games, the two preseason ranked teams that Georgia's currently playing, there's a chance that neither of those games feel as big then as they do now. But conversely, I think games like South Carolina and Auburn, I would mention. There's a lot of buzz lately around Kentucky. Maybe other folks might mention them. Some of those games might actually be a little bit bigger in the early stages of the season than people think they're going to be. So schedules have a way of evolving as the season plays out, and I guess that's where my mind is right now about the possible evolution of the Georgia schedule here for this season.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think some of you mentioned Kentucky. I think Kentucky is going to, I'm hearing more and more about Kentucky and the offensive coordinator. That quarterback does apparently, sounds like this guy's going to pan out there. So I'm wondering now if maybe Kentucky, I don't know if I'd say they're a bigger threat than Tennessee, but maybe that and Missouri, certainly Missouri's front seven. They gave Georgia trouble last year. Again, it's in Sanford Stadium. That's good. That's good news. Kirby's won 10 straight against ranked opponents in Sanford Stadium. Only lost one game to a ranked opponent in Sanford Stadium his entire career at Georgia, which is already going into year 8. I guess, and I'm with you. I agree about the Auburn game as well. I guess my thought is though that I don't know about I don't want to say a false sense of security, but we're not talking about, and it's so ridiculous how high we've set the bar. But we're not talking about this defensive line being effective against this SEC schedule. We're asking if they're going to be effective when they play Ohio State or Michigan in the playoff. And that's so far down the road. It's so ridiculous. But that's the way this Georgia team is now. I mean, I think we're all looking for the three-peat. We're all wondering if there could be another national championship. And they may be good, but, is there a team on the rise that's going to come out of nowhere? I think about Alabama in 2021. And, I'm sitting there watching Auburn and Alabama, and it's 10-3 in the fourth quarter, Brandon, before Bryce Young gets his first touchdown. And so we go to Atlanta just knowing that Georgia's going to kill them with this prolific defense, and Bryce Young puts 41 on the board. And you're like, what in the world just happened in 1 week to the best defense that I've ever seen Georgia have? So nothing's predictable. Nothing comes easy. It's the SEC, to your point. Maybe you're right. Maybe South Carolina turns out to be more interesting than a lot of people like myself are. I just think back last year they played in Columbia and they beat them by over 40 points. It really wasn't much of a game.
No, you're right about that. I mean, when you want to go back and look at the absolute, most obscene and brutal, not safe for like children performances from Georgia a year ago, like the South Carolina game, I am generally speaking higher on the market than on South Carolina. A lot of people are, but what Georgia did to South Carolina a year ago should be banned. Like there's no two ways about that. There's no evidence for an improved South Carolina on the basis of that game. They did play better after that for most of the year, but what Georgia did to South Carolina was as mean as what they did to anybody all year long.
Well, it was reminiscent of what 2017 Georgia did to Tennessee with Peyton Manning in attendance. They checked the stadium. I remember going on the show with you that week and saying this Georgia team is going to win the national championship. And you said, do not jinx this, Mike. So I'm telling you, what they did to Tennessee in Neyland Stadium with Peyton Manning in attendance and the checkerboards was just brutal. And I even said that day, I said, what is Tennessee doing checkerboarding their game against this Georgia team? If they've not been watching, this is going to get so bad. This is going to fire Georgia up so much. And they did. Oh, my gosh, they just destroyed them. And that's what South Carolina felt like. I was like, Spencer Rattler this, Spencer. And I do think he's fantastic. But he looks like a peewee quarterback. I mean, they were just over. They wanted out, Brandon. The stadium was more than half empty by the start of the second half. They wanted out of there. Nobody wanted to stick around except for, the 25 or 30,000 Georgia fans. That was brutal. And I wonder, how bad is it going to get against UT Martin? How bad is it going to get? What is Kirby going to do? Is he going to turn? Is Bobo going to show everybody and throw the ball 50 times? Are they going to put 60 and 70 points up in these first two games, or do you think Kirby puts the brakes on it and starts running the football, midway through the third quarter with some of these reserve running backs?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because, obviously, I think a lot of Georgia fans think a team like this, they like to see them score, you used the word 70, 60, 70 with more frequency. Maybe this is the year that, perhaps might happen. Let me do one more thing on what you were talking about before we shift gears to the conclusion of fall camp. Talk about the defensive line. That's obviously been a hot topic. Warren Brinson said some interesting things. Kirby Smart has talked about that. David Pollack has also talked about the defensive line. That's kind of the conversation that led off our show here today. But, Mike, the point that I have made, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to this, is that ultimately this defensive line, if you think about defensive tackles, will make McHale a little bit more of an edge rusher right now. If you think about the defensive line as defensive tackles, their ultimate job is stopping the run. And no team over the course of the last 2 years has been better at that than Georgia has been. 2020, you kind of throw that out the window because everything was weird in 2020. That's the one year in which Georgia was not really among the nation's best in overall defensive line performance. But go back and look at 2019, a team that I thought was pretty far removed from being a true national championship contender, but they were also awesome against the run that year too. To me, Mike, as much of a given as anything that exists for Georgia right now is this is a team that cuts off that leg to begin the game. They are not going to give you a running game. They're going to make you, if you're going to beat them, you're going to beat them one-dimensionally through the air, and good luck trying to do that when they group in the past. I am still fairly confident that Georgia's going to be good.
And like you said, I mean, these guys, Kirby said these guys are going to strike. These guys are going to play gap control. The only thing I would say is that you don't lose Jalen Carter and not feel it. You don't take away a generational talent like that and it not hurt your defense a little bit because, like Warren said yesterday, his presence was felt all over the field. And really, Brandon, it was felt in the game planning. Like, teams knew coming in. If 88's out there, once he came back healthy after that Missouri game, if 88's out there, you got a different game plan. And so a lot of your plays, you're not even running. It's over before it starts if 88's out there. Will this team affect the game plan in that way? And then I guess more specific to the Tennessee game, when we think about, and that to me was probably one of the most impressive Georgia football games I've ever seen. I mean, the score was 27-13. It might as well have been 50. They were, Tennessee didn't have it play longer than 20 yards until there was like 4 minutes left, and nobody cared. It was complete domination. It was one of the most glorious Georgia wins in history because a panel of experts had made Tennessee number one, which was just incredulous to me at that stage of the season. But they did. And then the Stetson Bennett. Anyway, the way they affected Tennessee, the way they pushed the pocket, dented the pocket, and blew up a lot of that offense before it really got started, I don't know that they can do that with Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson and Zion Logue. Also, it's on the road. Now, the Georgia fans were huge in that game. Hugely disruptive. I mean, what were there, 6 false starts, something like 4 or 5 sacks. Ridiculous that the Georgia fans contributed, 88 contributed. The Georgia fans won't be there to make things really loud on the Tennessee quarterback. Jalen Carter won't be there. That's where I get into the deep weeds. Now, the other 11 games of the year, I don't. Nobody's got an offense like Tennessee, and I don't even know Joe Milton can hit the side of a barn by that stage of the season. I mean, the guy's been wildly sporadic. I was watching some highlight. Indiana's greatest games. Indiana beat, Joe Milton in Michigan like 3 or 4 years ago. The guy's been inconsistent. So I don't know. Tennessee may not even be a factor. Like you said, they could have 2 or 3 losses and they might have a new quarterback by then. I don't know. But my only thought is you're not going to push the pocket the same. You're still going to push the pocket because, to your point, this is still a super talented defensive line, probably arguably as good, if not better than any in the league. But you're taking away what I believe is one of the best defensive tackles that college football has seen in the last 25 years. I'd put him in the top 3 or 4. He was that dynamic. And what happens next?
We'll certainly find out. It's our Georgia Farm Bureau practice report with Mike Griffith here on DawgNation Daily. And don't forget, Georgia Farm Bureau, living, working, participating in life and communities just like yours across the great state of Georgia, and taking your kids to sports and all the things that kind of go on in your life each and every day. And they want to provide you great insurance products as you go through them. I'm talking about home insurance, I'm talking about life insurance, I'm talking about auto insurance, all of that available for you. You've heard me say before that Georgia Farm Bureau is always the home team. When you check them out online at gfbinsurance.com, you can find out about that there as well. They are as excited about the start of the football season coming up as anybody in our, on our team here and our audience is. They love it, and they love being a part of it with you, and they want to provide you great service for all your insurance needs. So find them online at gfbinsurance.com. That's gfbinsurance.com. Georgia Farm Bureau is always the home team. Mike, I'll give you kind of an overarching question here to kind of wrap things up today. Kirby Smart told us Saturday that in his mind the fall camp portion of the preseason had ended. Georgia kind of moving on to the next phase here. So now that it's all said and done, what did we learn from Georgia during fall camp?
Well, Kirby Smart said they're behind where they were the last 2 years. That's what the head coach said. Now, whether that's coach speak or not, I don't really know. I thought it was interesting that he emphasized that the other quarterbacks are going to continue to get number one reps and compete. To me, that kind of lays the foundation that we'll probably see 2 or 3 quarterbacks play in the first 2 games of the season. Now, is that window dressing to keep everybody happy? Or is Kirby wondering in the back of his mind if down the road there's a chance we might see more than one quarterback this season? I don't know the answers to those questions. That begged questions to me. The way he phrased it, saying, well, kind of experience and reps was kind of the difference. He didn't say Carson was head and shoulders better. He didn't say Carson Beck really leads the team. He didn't say those things. He said experience was the difference. And that didn't motivate. It made me go, oh, wow. That made me go, okay, that's interesting. Let's stay tuned, right? That was kind of my take. Stay tuned. Now, Carson Beck might go out there and throw for 500 yards in the opener and win a Heisman Trophy this year. I have no idea. I think the quarterback situation, I'm not going to say it's unsettled because Carson's the starter, but I'll say nothing would surprise me. I just say nothing would surprise because Kirby left it that open. It felt very vague. Carson's, and the other thing, Brandon, was interesting is he actually told the quarterbacks early in the week. Scrimmage 2 had nothing to do with this.
Yeah.
Scrimmage 1, he was unhappy with all of them. So I thought it was really interesting the way it played out, and I'm still just kind of this is all interesting to me. I want to see how they look in games. Go back and read everything he said. It was just, I don't know, it was muddled. It wasn't clear cut. It wasn't like last year it was all Sted, or the year before it was all JT, or the year before it was muddled. It was kind of like 2020, right? Dwan ends up starting. It's funny. I did a story today on Beck. Him saying he thought about transferring last year, and a lot of teams contacted him. And Aaron Murray watched the 2020 practice, and he said the guy that really impressed him the most was Carson Beck. In 2020, he said, now Dwan did some really good things. This is a guy to watch. And he said, I'll be interested to see JT Daniels. Didn't even mention Stetson Bennett. It's just so the Georgia quarterback situation is always interesting to me. Hey, as long as they keep winning games, I don't think anybody really cares. But I think this is a fascinating time in the offensive backfield, whether we're talking quarterbacks, Andrew Paul. We're hearing his name a lot, Brandon. Hearing his name a lot. We're seeing highlights of him. Is Kendall going to play? I don't know. Kirby says, well, he's been out a long time. Well, we know that, Coach. Why did you feel like you had to say it that way? Right? There's just a lot of, Branson Robinson hadn't been hit yet. He's looking better. Haven't heard Dejon Edwards' name very much at all. So to me, the Georgia offensive backfield is just a cloud of mystery. I don't know who the leading rusher is going to be. I'm not exactly sure what happens with the quarterback situation. A lot of talented players, plenty of time to figure it out. But to me, that's probably the most interesting facet is that offensive backfield.
Mike, we'll certainly be looking forward to reading a bunch from you there at DawgNation.com and all these subjects and a whole lot more. And seeing you in Athens here coming up in just a couple of weeks there as well. Thank you for being a part of this Georgia Farm Bureau practice report here today. And we'll see you soon, very soon, back here on DawgNation Daily again as well.
All right, look forward to it. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I think the quarterback stuff is obviously, pretty fascinating, but we also saw, Kirby Smart step up, I believe, speak clearly about that, on Saturday, naming Beck as the starter, something that Kirby has not always done prior to seasons. But as I said before, he's typically okay about being candid about how some of that's kind of playing out there, and that was the candor that led him to name Beck as the starter. And I do believe that what Mike says kind of lines up with some of what I'd heard too, which is going into the scrimmage, you sort of already knew if you were around that Georgia program that Beck was going to be treated as the number one quarterback during all of that, that a lot of this was kind of building to that, and Saturday was the next phase of that, and that's kind of what led Kirby, I guess, to make the announcement that he made when all of that was said and done. And ultimately my expectation here is, assuming performance-wise this is, called into question, or injury-wise it gets called into question, moving forward here, I think you're going to see Georgia treat its quarterbacks in kind of a traditional manner. The Carson Beck's going to be treated like the starter, and he's going to get the starter reps deep into, the second half of games, in most cases, even these games against like the UT Martins and the whatnots, because that's what you typically do with your starting quarterback. And if Brock Vandagriff holds on to be the number 2 quarterback, then he will get the kind of snaps and opportunities typically reserved for a number 2 quarterback. There's always a pocket of Georgia fans who want Georgia to use like the second half of games as kind of a sort of a preview for like next year's G-Day, and Georgia's just never going to do that. Most teams are never going to do that. That there is not an open audition for the 2024 quarterback during the 2023 season. That's just not how it works. By the way, Carson Beck, we should remember, could come back next year too, and perhaps he will. So, that's the other factor on all of that. But my expectation, a lot of this sort of plays out like the last couple of years have. Now, if you're Georgia, you hope the end of the season result plays out that way too. But in terms of how the quarterback thing goes, where, Beck's the starter last year, he was the backup, people wanted to see him more. Now he's the starter, people are going to be tired of that. They want to see the next guy, Vandegrift or Gunner or whoever else. But ultimately, Georgia's going to treat its backup quarterbacks the way that pretty much every team treats its backup quarterbacks, unless some sort of injury thing or some sort of performance thing becomes a factor in all of that. I don't think you'll see Georgia depart from its typical protocol on the quarterback situation, but we will see. And I would say I'm even more sure of that given the announcement that Kirby made on Saturday. And with that said, let's go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here right now, and let's get you excited. Now, I've been hearing from some folks. Our comment section's been buzzing about this. Sign-ups continue every single day for that DawgNation cruise, April 22nd through the 26th, on board Allure of the Seas. This is an Oasis-class ship, one of the largest ships at sea. That means the DawgNation cruise for 2024 is going to be bigger and better than it's ever been. And that means we need you on board to enjoy it. The Oasis-class ships, like Allure of the Seas, have so many specialty restaurants, fun bars and lounges, entertainment options on board, special shows. Remember, one of the things that the Oasis-class ship has, just as a for instance, the back of the ship you have what's called the Aqua Theater. It's like an amphitheater, open air, right there in the back of the ship. It's where the high diving show takes place. And I've been on a couple of different Oasis-class ships, and so I've seen a couple of the the various Aqua Theater style shows. One of the best forms of entertainment you'll ever see. I mean, it really is amazing. While the ship is moving at sea, these folks get, I don't know how tall it is. It looks like 50, 60 feet, something along those lines. And that may not be the distance, whatever. But it's really, really, really high in the air. Diving from way up there, down into the water. It's an amazing show. It's the kind of things that the Oasis-class ships provide, and that's the kind of ship we're going to be on board this April. So go to royaldogs.com. A great travel agent named Jessica Slater. She's got that website for you to help you get booked up for the DawgNation cruise. royaldogs.com for more on that. All right, update on the first big game of the season next Thursday. Florida Lousy Stinking Gators going to Salt Lake City to take on the Utah Utes. Now, there has been some massive, massive point spread movement in this game. There are these things in the early portion of the year, certainly early portion of the spring and summer, called look-ahead lines. They are games of the year, big games that are going to generate a lot of interest. A lot of point spreads will be placed on these big games as a way of just kind of getting some attention for the sports books. And you typically reserve low-limit betting for this. You can't go bet big dollars on a football game 5 months from now. I'm not sure you'd want to anyway, but you can. It's typically a low-limit bet. As the game gets closer, you take more action, larger bets on games. But if you want to follow where the point spread for Florida, Utah has been to where it is now, you see a remarkable evolution here. For a long time during the spring and summer, Utah had been about a 10 or a 10.5 point favorite against Florida. In some cases, it got up to close to 11, I think. I think we saw some 11s at one point in time. Well, now you have seen a dramatic about face. Utah, as we've been telling you, has been dealing with a significant series of quarterback injuries, most prominently Cam Rising, the terrific Utah quarterback, injured in last year's bowl game. But his backup is apparently also hurt too. Now, there is a possibility that Rising plays, but there's also a growing sense that he might not as we get closer to game time. Kyle Whittingham, the Utah coach, is notorious for not revealing much about these kinds of injuries, so he's not saying much about Rising right now, but the general sense, obviously based on the point spread movement, because now a line that was at one point in time 10, 10.5 is down to about 4.5 now. If you go look at this, there is belief that Rising won't play, the backup may be in trouble, Utah may be down to its third string, and then finally, 2 quarterback injuries. That might be enough for Florida to actually have a quarterback advantage for a change, with the Wisconsin transfer Graham Mertz making his first start for the Lousy Stinking Gators. Now, I'm going to tell you right now my general feeling about this. All of this feels like a dramatic overreaction. When the 10.5 point line was placed, the status of Rising was unknown there at the moment. So this is not one of those situations where we're only just now finding out the Rising injury. The Rising's been hurt the entire calendar year as it is. The backup quarterback is obviously a little bit of a new thing, but a backup quarterback does not move a line 3 points. It just doesn't. Cam Rising, I'm not quite so sure, is worth moving a line by a touchdown. There's a certain degree of his injury was already probably kind of baked into this spread as it was, but the overall take here, if you're a Gators fan, all of a sudden this game feels like one of those games you might have a little bit more of a chance of winning. All of a sudden now the pressure kind of builds on Billy Napier. It's one thing to go out and lose to a potential like Rose Bowl type team in the Pac-12 when they're playing in their own stadium, but if they've got 2 quarterback injuries and you still can't find a way to win, then all of a sudden a forgivable loss becomes the kind of thing you have to wear a little bit more. So this game's fascinating to me right now. I think the line movement here, the only right choice is to fall all over Utah. Did you love him at 10.5? Perhaps you didn't. If you don't love him at 4.5, I don't quite know what you're looking at here. So we got plenty of time to figure this out between now and next Thursday. But that is a very, very interesting scenario in terms of the movement, the shift in the direction of the Gators for that big non-conference game next Thursday night. Speaking of the lousy, stinking Gators, massive criticism right now for Netflix. Now, let me be full disclosure here for a moment. I hate Netflix. For a long time, I didn't have Netflix. And then a couple of years ago, got it because there's this like Christmas movie my kids like, and so we got it so Netflix so we could watch this particular movie. Like I've been a subscriber to like Disney Plus and HBO, so I've got plenty of the subscriptions just for a long time until like 2 years ago did not have Netflix. And in the 2 years that I've had it, and I don't mean to overstate this, I mean this bluntly, I haven't seen one thing on Netflix that I've liked. Not one thing. I find their documentaries to be childish. I find their dramas to be vapid. I find the content on Netflix to be of a very, very low quality. And if Netflix went off my TV tomorrow, I'm not sure I'd ever really miss it. I don't think any of the content's very good. I love the PGA Tour. I thought Full Swing was boring. And pretty much that's just the vibe I get from almost everything on Netflix. Nothing is quite as good as it should be. And almost any kind of comparative series on, like, say, HBO, or I guess it's called Max now, almost any comparative series on HBO or now Max, way better to me than Netflix. I think that Netflix is pretty low-quality content. So that's my backstory on this. Now, the Florida documentary is sort of an example of that. You want to talk about a whitewashing of an era. And this Florida documentary is called Swamp Kings, I believe, and it's kind of looking back at the Urban Meyer championship run there at Florida. And listen, I'm glad Florida has this, dust off this old relic of a history and kind of go back in time and relive your glory days, which all of a sudden now was a long time ago. So I'm glad that Florida fans have this to kind of keep themselves company, because not quite so sure this season is going to provide them very many happy memories. So you might as well go back and reach to your now distant past to find whatever memories you can. But while Florida was winning this championship with Tim Tebow, obviously a compelling figure, I won't deny that, there's also a lot of controversial things going around the Florida program, too. My understanding is, based on the chatter that's out there, none of this is touched by the Netflix documentary at all. There's almost no mention of Aaron Hernandez, at least the Aaron Hernandez as we know him, which Netflix has also made a documentary about. This idea that he doesn't get mentioned in this documentary when they made another documentary about the other, murders that Hernandez is alleged to have been a part of, or convicted to be a part of, whatever the proper phrasing there. That no mention of the Pouncey twins, no mention of really anything as it relates to any of the real stuff going on with Florida there at that time. And the other thing, and Alabama fans are all over themselves about this, and on this particular case, I'll side with the Alabama fans. This idea that when Florida lost to Alabama in the 2009 SEC championship, it gets spun by Tebow during the documentary. As it's been relayed to me, I haven't seen it, my eyes won't look at it, but it's been relayed to me that Tebow sells this as Florida lost the game because Florida had everything to lose, Alabama had nothing to lose, and therefore they were able to play looser than Florida was allowed to play. But the truth is, and you'll remember this, Florida was ranked number 1 going into that 2009 SEC championship, but Alabama was also undefeated. They were ranked number 2. The idea they were some gigantic underdog that was taking advantage of, hey, we got nothing to lose type mentality going into a game like that. I can promise you the Alabama sideline, I was at the Georgia Dome that day for that year's SEC championship. I can promise you they didn't view that the same way. They viewed that as their moment. Our buddy Mike Johnson played in that game. In fact, Mike would be a fun one to ask exactly how it was that Alabama viewed that. My guess is they won't agree with Tim Tebow's assessment. So the point is, let me do you the biggest favor I'll do for you all week. Don't waste your time with this garbage from Netflix. It's been universally panned as a very small snapshot of a team that admittedly had a lot of interesting figures and characters on it, but none of the interesting stuff actually portrayed in this Netflix documentary. It is simply boring because all it does is tell a tiny snapshot of what was actually going on. So I'm not even sure it's worth anyone's time. I'm sure Florida fans will like it because it's all they got. But for the rest of us, we're probably best left skipping this and instead watching Florida lose at Utah next week. Five-star prospect Edric Houston made his college decision yesterday. No huge surprise here, I don't think. Georgia not really a factor in this. Houston goes to Ohio State, the place that he was sort of expected to go overall. But count me in the group, and I've said this before. At some point in time, we need to have a more serious conversation about all these Gwinnett kind of guys, in this case another Buford player, who are getting away and going other places. Had a chance to interview Mike Matthews on Saturday, the outstanding Parkview wide receiver, and I'm telling you right now, willing blocker, plays both sides of the ball, even for a 7A team, just a really solid, salt-of-the-earth type guy. And that's a guy that never really strongly considered Georgia. Now, ultimately, this is not hurting Georgia's recruiting efforts. Georgia's still collecting elite classes, and they have, of course, won the last 2 national championships. They're going to win again here this year, I believe. But at a certain point in time, one county with so many elite players and such a large point in time having a little bit more of a substantial conversation about exactly why that is, I think that's probably an appropriate thing to do. A couple of other stories here real quick, or actually let's just do, 2 more stories real quick. So this doesn't matter to you, but I do think it's interesting. There's a guy named Lee Fitting, who's longtime producer of ESPN's College GameDay, and apparently he is also out at the network. And I'm not going to make too big of a deal about a behind-the-scenes guy no longer working on ESPN's College GameDay, but it is another example of what we're seeing here. ESPN, y'all, is not what it once was. It's just not. And if you're the SEC, you have got to be aware of this, that the power and prestige that the worldwide leader in sports once had has kind of gone away. And ESPN's future right now is pretty murky. Do they get spun off and bought by somebody else? Do they make the shift from what is right now the traditional cable model where they get paid by the subscribers to cable while also making some advertising money? Or do they try to make a shift into the next 5 years to what you call like over the top, where they're kind of offering a la carte option? People can pay ESPN directly to consume the product. Typically, those kinds of transitions are not without some bumps in the road. And when you see all of the personnel, both on camera and behind the scenes, who are gone from ESPN, this is an organization that has diminished in prestige here the last couple of years. And moving forward, it's the only media partner the SEC is going to have. The strength of ESPN, what it can do to protect its strength, what it can do to add to its strength, something it desperately needs to do. That's an important SEC-related topic here right now. SEC needs a strong ESPN, and seemingly ESPN is getting weaker by the day. You don't care about this either, but I'll tell you this as kind of a footnote to this. Technically speaking right now, there's actually greater clearance for FS1 than ESPN. In other words, the cable network FS1, that's Fox Sports 1, is actually in a tiny fragment more homes right now through the traditional cable model than ESPN is. That's an example of where ESPN once was to kind of where it is right now. Around 70 million subscribers to its networks. A little bit of a tricky situation here moving forward. That's worth watching. And then finally, a couple of Pac-12 quarterback announcements worth noting. DJ Uiagalelei, the former Clemson quarterback, now at Oregon State. He has been named the starter there in Corvallis. And Jaden Rashada, you'll remember him as the quarterback supposed to go to Florida, exorbitant NIL rumors. It was, said by Rashada that Florida could not give him the money they promised him. Florida folks have a little bit of a different spin on that in terms of who actually promised that money. But one way or another, Rashada ended up at Arizona State. Very young quarterback, by the way, for a very young head coach in Kenny Dillingham. And out west in Tempe, Sparky has announced that Rashada will be the Sun Devil starting quarterback. So a couple of quarterbacks you've heard of. DJ Uiagalelei going to start for Oregon State. Jaden Rashada, the former elite recruit, going to start for Arizona State. and we'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, a couple of notes here for a moment. First of all, make sure you try yourself some finished long drink here right now. And our buddy Jeff Santel has been on a search for the long drink peach-flavored version, and he found some. So he has found some. He's enjoying it. Our buddy Michael Carvel wants to try some of that there as well. So listen, go to thelongdrink.com. Put in your zip code. That'll tell you where you can pick some up. And I still like the traditional. I'm just like an old school guy, I guess. My favorite is still grapefruit gin kick. I just like that. That's just a good mixed drink, especially when you're outside. And if you're not familiar by now, hopefully you are, the finished long drink is a ready-to-drink cocktail. It's essentially a mixed drink in a can. So the grapefruit, citrus with the gin, still my kind of favorite, but people love that peach flavored right now. Jeff has tried it. He loves it. You can go to thelongdrink.com. You can try it for yourself. And as you're enjoying the start to tailgate season here coming up, I think the finished long drink, a pretty good thing to pack into that cooler as you head out there on game day. Now, speaking of tailgate and have a good time and enjoying happy hour and everything like that, don't forget, tomorrow, DawgNation Happy Hour presented by Marlowe's Tavern. That returns with our buddy our buddy Kaylee Manziel. Easy for me to say. Kaylee Manziel hosting once again. And then next Thursday, Kaylee going to be on hand live along with so many of the rest of us from DawgNation at the Marlowe's in Brookhaven for a live broadcast of the DawgNation Happy Hour presented by Marlowe's Tavern at Marlowe's Tavern. The Marlowe's there in Brookhaven. That's next Thursday, August 31st. We're going to do a kind of a happy hour hangout at 5 p.m., live broadcast of the show at 6 p.m., which next Thursday is a different time. Normally the show airs at 7 p.m. tomorrow night. That'll be when it's on. But next Thursday at a different time, 6 p.m. for the broadcast, 5 p.m. for a little happy hour hangout. Let me tell you something. There's no telling what's going to happen on air next week when you got a little happy hour hangout and a live broadcast of the show. It could get a little wild in person next week at the Marlowe's in Brookhaven. So I hope you'll tune in to find more about that next week. DawgNation Happy Hour live from the Marlowe's in Brookhaven. We can't wait to see you there. All right, for our golden shoe, this is very funny. I'm going to send you this guy's Twitter to sort of see this for yourself. Austin Kilby sent this in to us here. So yesterday we were talking about Lou Holtz, and I have like a weird nostalgia for back when Lou Holtz was sharing like the worst opinions ever on ESPN late at night, the Game Day Final Show, whatever it was called. So Holtz was always saying crazy stuff, and yesterday we brought this up because he's got a preseason rankings that it gets published somewhere, and he had Georgia number 5 on this. On his preseason ranking, which is kind of bulletin board material, but also kind of funny because it's just more in a long string of just horrible takes for Lou Holtz, who kind of comes across as a pretty good dude, but has some pretty wretched college football takes through the decades. Well, anyway, Austin Kilby shared this and said, BA, you mentioned Lou Holtz in your show yesterday. Never forget this comedic gem. It was spot-on impersonation. So what it is Pat McAfee during one of those sort of extra broadcasts for the Georgia-TCU game, bringing on a guy doing the Holtz impersonation, and it was very funny. If you check out Austin Kilby on Twitter, you can see that. We'll give Austin a golden shoe for that today. Appreciate him sharing that. Very funny stuff. And, of course, our Gator Hater countdown. Speaking of the lousy, stinking Gators, Netflix may not have the guts to tell the truth about Florida, but around here we do. 66 days from now, a bad day for the Gators gets even worse when Georgia beats up on them there in the cocktail party. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We will look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. A quick assessment of my performance. I don't quite know how this turned into such a long show. I feel like that somewhere last couple of minutes kind of got away from us there a little bit, but hopefully it was good. But trying to come in an hour or less, and today we leapt across that little boundary. So I apologize there on that, but glad to have you with us. We will probably not go as long comments today because we went really long yesterday. Let's see what else. The Biscuit says Tennessee at Florida is going to be extremely tight. Y'all, if you care about point spreads, things like that, this is where this gets interesting. You don't have to bet the game to be interested in the projections. Tennessee is not a huge favorite at Florida. They are a slight favorite, but the early look-aheads on Tennessee-Florida has put that in the category of game where Tennessee better be careful. That was the category that game kind of got put into. Johnny Surf Dog says we've had more buffering today. Johnny, I'm sorry to hear that. I am very sorry to hear that. I just don't know. Very, very sorry to hear. Let's see what else. The Biscuit says Florida beating Utah would be very damning to the Pac-12's playoff chances. Yeah, I mean, I think the Pac-12 is an interesting league this year. First of all, as someone who's kind of like hopelessly trapped in nostalgia most of the time, I'll be very nostalgic for the Pac-12 this year, even though I kind of don't really like the league and always am taking shots at the league. I still am going to be sad to see it go away. I believe that's the eventual fate here. So kind of traditional old-school Pac-12, the last time to have the USC, UCLA's, the Four Corner schools, they're all leaving. So kind of a fun year to kind of watch this one more time. But also when you look at, this is a league that has probably more overall depth than it's had, at least in a while. Utah's probably still pretty good. I think UCLA may be sneaky good this year. USC obviously has Caleb Williams. Both the Oregon schools stand to be pretty good. Washington's a preseason top 10 team. Washington may be the most interesting team of all in that group that I'm mentioning. So, you talk about the Pac-12 playoff chances. If I just rattle you off that many teams that have the potential to be playoff teams, then you'd clearly say, well, they should be a part of the playoff discussion. But the problem the Pac-12 has had is, sometimes it's not a terrible league. Like on balance, most years the Pac-12 is better than the ACC, I believe. So it's not always a terrible league. Now it's pillow soft, but in terms of the quality of play, offensive side of the ball, things like that, quality of the coaches sometimes, not terrible. I'll take the Pac-12. Neutral field, random Pac-12 team against random ACC team. Sight unseen, I'll take the Pac-12 team. If it's Florida State or Clemson, obviously that changes. But if it's just a random team pulled at random from the Pac-12 or team pulled out of a hat from the ACC, I'll take the Pac-12 team over the ACC team, typically speaking. So it's not a terrible league. And this year it's probably a little bit on balance stronger than it's been. But the thing the Pac-12 teams have had trouble with is not cannibalizing each other. Okay, I beat you, you beat me. This team now steps in, beats both of us, but then they lose to the next team. There's just some of that seems to go on. That's the thing the Pac-12's got to try to avoid here this year. The Biscuit says those long drinks are good. Biscuit, I'm glad you're enjoying that. Let's see what else. And some of y'all on Nature Gator, like I genuinely like Nature Gator. He's been with us for a long time. I would say that what Nature Gator does on YouTube does not count as trolling. Nature's just in here talking, right? He likes his team. He comes to talk to Georgia fans. That doesn't count as trolling. Some of what Nature sometimes does on Twitter, I would say probably, Nature, I'm just being honest with you, I would say some of that probably does go in the direction of trolling, just trying to stir up Georgia fans. Listen, do I troll every now and then? Maybe I'm guilty of that too. But I don't think what Nature does in our comment section is trolling at all. There are others who come in here and they do troll. They're just trying to get attention, trying to say whatever. I think that Nature Gator, is absolutely, typically speaking, on his best behavior in this comment section. And I also think, I think for the most part, G Grace kind of is too. I know some of y'all go at G Grace pretty hard, but for the most part, that's what G Grace does too. Some of what Nature does in my mentions to other Georgia fans on Twitter, I'd say that's probably a little bit more trollish, I would suggest. Trevor Maffetone says, what do you think happens to the SEC if ESPN fails? I don't think anybody knows, Trevor, but I think it's a fair question to ask. I would say that ESPN's a long way from failing, and I don't want to turn this into like CNBC, but like Bob Iger said on CNBC a couple of weeks ago, that's the Disney chairman, they may consider selling ABC. Then this is the traditional over-the-air broadcast network that big SEC games are likely to be aired on the next couple of years. Everything's on the table right now for ESPN, ABC, Disney. It's all on the table. If they were to spin off ABC and sell it but not sell ESPN, what does that do to the SEC? That's a big platform for the SEC to air on. And here's one of the things you see. In some form or fashion, digital is going to be a bigger part of sports broadcasts in the future. But it's not obvious how that's going to play out right now. In other words, we know the future of video content is streaming, that you just see the movement here. And Netflix, as bad as their content is the clear leader in all of that. The Disney Pluses and the others, they've had a hard time matching the success that Netflix has clearly enjoyed. So when it comes to watching shows, dramas, movies, things like that, you're either already doing that on streaming or in the future you're going to exclusively do that on streaming. But the sports part of this, I don't think is nearly as obvious. And there's always like a pocket of like people who are far younger than me that want to jump in the conversation and sort of flaunt their youth. Oh man, you got to get used to the streaming stuff. Y'all, when it comes to sports and streaming, that is not a very happy marriage here right now. It's not. The Pac-12, the thing that ultimately caused the Pac-12 to dissolve was the fact that so much of their content was going to be hidden behind a sort of streaming platform and no one was going to see it. And therefore, the Pac-12 decided, the presidents that make these decisions decided that wasn't good enough, and that's essentially kind of dissolved the whole league. There is massive frustration right now in the Big Ten country because of the games they're going to be airing on Peacock here this year. The reason why people don't like streaming in sports is because there's a larger delay in some cases, but also because if I'm watching TV, I'm clicking to this game, I'm clicking to that game, I'm moving. When it comes to the streaming part of this, the ability to exit out of a stream, exit into a new stream to go watch another game, exit out of that, come into the new stream, that's not, old man can't figure out how to do this. Like, it's not the same experience. It's just not. And so I think there's a chance that TV and sports, like traditional TV, may stay connected a little longer than perhaps some folks think they will, just from the standpoint of, sports on TV is still a really big deal. And frankly, it's not obvious that these, the Apple, for instance, like Apple likes soccer because soccer is worldwide. College football is not worldwide. It's not. College football is a huge deal in America, and frankly, it's a much bigger deal in certain parts of America. But people in like Germany and Uzbekistan, they're not watching tons of college football necessarily. Some people in every country probably are, but not large numbers anywhere else outside the United States. And the kind of sports that big, large cap, things like Apple have kind of gone after in the past, that's, they want global sports. College football is not a global sport. So I don't know how much of a streaming revolution we have coming anytime soon in college football, just given the specific nature of the product. G. Grace says that he had Florida winning at Utah until he found out the game was on the road. Now he's torn. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it's an unwinnable game for Florida. I don't believe they will win it. And certainly as the line goes down, I like Utah more and more. But, this is one of those things where, like, I don't really care about a lot of the math nerd stuff anymore, but, like, Florida is in the top 20 of the ESPN preseason FPI. In other words, if they get semi-competent quarterback play, they have a chance to be one of the improved teams in the SEC, if you believe those numerical metrics at all. I kind of don't think Florida's going to be very good, but, this is not an unwinnable game. And if it is an unwinnable game, then Florida's a lot farther away from being competitive than maybe any of us have imagined. Nature Gator, very kind words. I appreciate that, Nature. Paul Moon says, how am I feeling about the kicker competition? I don't know. I think we probably don't talk enough about the kicker because Georgia's had two really good kickers for a long time. So Podlesny took the baton from Blankenship, and Blankenship started being the Georgia kicker in 2016. So for the entirety of the Kirby Smart era, Georgia's had two kickers, and they've almost never given us any reason to think about them from like a negative standpoint for certain. So there's a chance that's probably a pretty big deal. I guess, Paul, this kind of comes back to something I say a pretty good bit, which is, if Georgia's in a position like Ohio State was, there's an old line that people say sometimes that field goals are failure. Like Ohio State had to settle for a 50-yard field goal attempt against Georgia in the Peach Bowl last year because they failed to get the ball any closer. they failed to get it into the end zone. And so they had to settle for that. So I think it stands to reason at some point in time Georgia won't have quite as automatic of a kicker as Podlesny or Blankenship before that proved to be. And when that's the case, then you defeat yourself when you settle for those field goals. That's kind of where that comes down to. Let me go to Facebook for a moment. And yes, I know I probably spent too long of a time on the YouTube platform here today, and I apologize for that. Let's see what else. On Facebook, Ken Holcomb, thanks for the kind words. Been to a lot of doctor's appointments. Kent's had a little bit of a battle with cancer, but he is doing amazing, and at least that was our last report on that. So, Ken, I'm glad to know you're doing well. Jonathan Moore says, Podlesny did miss a couple field goals last year. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Jason Thomas, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I really do. I have, and nobody wants to hear my sob story, but I have been like beyond swamped away from the show as of late. It's one of the reasons why I like sitting and doing comments, because it takes me away from everything else I would be doing. So, Jason, I appreciate you being so kind. I really do. And I am sorry I'm so derelict. I really am. Mitchell Proctor says he asks about the kicking game all the time. So Mitchell's trying to move us in the direction we should be going, and I'm a little slow to get there sometimes. Slow about participating on Facebook, slow about talking about kickers. So I probably own both those things. Let's see what else. Let's see what else is going on here. Barry Watkins says, I ain't happy about watching the first Dogs game on my phone. Yeah, and I think this goes beyond just the sort of typical thing of, well, it just takes a little while to get used to. I think some of the streaming stuff in sports goes beyond that by a long shot. The TV experience for sports is just far more convenient, I believe, than the experience of trying to watch it via stream. Now, there's obviously ways to like put it on the big screen and they have the experience, with smart TV that looks very similar. But I mean, I can tell you this from doing the Thursday night Amazon NFL games. I watch a lot of Georgia baseball on SEC Network Plus, which I'm, on the one hand, like something like that, I'm glad that exists, because prior to SEC Network Plus, this stuff just wasn't on anywhere. So when it comes to some of the peripheral sports stuff, I'll take streaming for that all day long, because that didn't exist prior to it. But there's still the thing of, well, if I'm watching Georgia baseball, the Braves, or, I don't know what else I might be watching, that the sort of click back, and then you got to do the spinning wheel of death to get into the stream. Plus, unless I'm doing it wrong, you can't pause the stream the way that you can live TV, right? It seems like I can't. I don't know. Let's see what else. Philip Jordan Wells said we had both trolls and elves here on Facebook today. Philip, that's very funny. Always a funny guy. Let's see what else. Jonathan Moore said he'd never be in another show's audience. Here's the thing, though, is like, and I don't mean to come across as modest, there's just not a lot of shows out there that kind of do every day like we do, kind of a normal type time thing here. So that's one of the things that's kind of drawn other fans of other shows to us, is the fact that there aren't a lot of people doing this every day the way that we do. They're, more-ish than there used to be, but not quite still a lot. Let's see what. Yeah, they're having a good time over on Facebook. All right, let me go to DawgNation.com for a minute, and we'll get ready to wrap it up for today. All right, on DawgNation.com here for a minute. Dan in Arkansas has got Florida winning 5 games this year. If they do, and that's right there around their, that's right there around their total. I believe their total is about 5.5, I think. If Florida wins 5, that's trouble. That's trouble. DT says there's been a lot of streaming issues today. DT, thanks for the heads up, and I'm very, very sorry to hear that. B-Mac asking what games I'm calling this week. We actually have the Great Atlanta Bash here this week, which I'm excited about. It's 4 games in total. I've got the game on Friday night, and this is going to be a fun one. Calhoun against Carver of Atlanta, there from Henderson Stadium at Midtown. That's going to be really cool. And then on Saturday, another fun game for me. I've got Douglas and Washington on Saturday night. Great Atlanta Bash, kind of a showcase of a lot of the Atlanta public school teams. So that will be really fun. And then Matt Stewart joins us for 2 games prior to that on Saturday too. So great triple header on Saturday and a fun game on Friday night. So I am looking forward to being a part of that. By the way, it's going to be hot this weekend too. Third and Will wants to go on Netflix, not watch the Gator show, but give it a thumbs down rating. I don't mind that. Laura Kigwiba, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, Laura. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name, but I did see this, that after years of lobbying support, she says the state of Tennessee finally has a UGA license plate. I saw some of this online. Happy to see that. I know our friends down in Florida just got their Georgia-themed license plates. Now Tennessee has those as well. So for those of you who live up there in the volunteer state, in enemy territory, you get a chance to now show off your Georgia red and black colors in kind of an official designation. Laura, that's really cool. Thank you for bringing that up. I had seen that. Yard Dog also agrees with me that the original long drink is the right choice there, which I'm really glad to hear. DT said, I heard Rusty say 4 games in 1 week, and he'll never do that again. Like the Corky Kell Classic and Corky Kell Dave Hunter Classic now is a lot of fun, but it is a lot of work. And it's one of those things where it's always more than you realize, but it's also like one time a year. So, and it's kind of like the introduction back to football. But yeah, so Rusty and I did 6. So from Wednesday to Saturday, we did a total of 6 games. That's a lot. But it's really fun, and I'm really thankful for it. And looking forward to, for me, 2 more this weekend. Then after that, we'll be on just the traditional 1 game a week schedule. We do have a doubleheader coming up for our Hall of Fame game this year. But everything else is just kind of a basic, drive for the GHSA state title. And by the way, we're going to have a fun one next week to kind of kick off what I sort of think of as the regular season. That's not the right way to say it, but I think of that as the regular season because that's when we get into, we're not in the event, Great Atlanta Bash, Corky Kell Classic time of year anymore. Our kickoff to our drive for the GHSA state title is Carrollton at Rome. I got to tell you, of all the teams that I saw last week, relative to my expectations pregame, Rome may have been the most impressive. That is still a really good team. And obviously Carrollton's got Juju Lewis. Now, they also suffered a pretty serious injury with Bryce Hicks, their outstanding running back, in the game against Hughes last week. But that's going to be a lot of fun. BMAC going to be going to the Mill Creek Norcross game. Norcross, I didn't do the Norcross game, but my gosh, I did not have them handling Marietta as easily as they did. That was pretty impressive. DT says I'm going to need a new wingman if Rusty's not going to do all those games. Rusty says that, but Rusty ain't missing none of those games. He may say that, but he's not missing any of those games. I can promise you that. All right, one final trip around the comment section. Scotty Barnes says he had some issues commentating today, or commenting, I should mean to say. I haven't seen that. But Scotty, I am sorry about that. Isha Murphy on the subject of the streaming stuff says there are so many ways to do it. It just depends on what electronics you have. I know how to set them up all up. Just message me. So Isha, that's really nice of you to say. I appreciate that. And while Barry said that, he doesn't like the idea of watching on his phone, like my issue with the streaming, that doesn't have anything to do with the device. Obviously, smart TVs make it pretty easy now to watch sports, on the regular TV screen. A lot of you watch DawgNation. In fact, I always like it when you share me, the photo of you watching me on your regular TV. Just kind of a cool thing to see. A lot of you will do that from time to time. I appreciate that. My issue is when it comes to watching a game, there's that thought of, you want to flip back and forth between other games, and that gets hard to do. Now, if it's a Georgia game, you may not be doing as much flipping during the commercials, admittedly speaking. But when it's like a NFL Sunday or a college football Saturday outside the window where Georgia's playing, you kind of want to follow 4 or 5 games at once, and that gets a little bit tricky. Now, there are a lot of people who have multiple screens now, and maybe they just do it that way. Maybe that's the way that it goes. But, listen, I'd like to congratulate the Rockefellers on doing that. Some of us still got one TV in the room. All right, let's go back to YouTube one more time and be done. DMar42 says he thinks the Florida schedule goes a long way into its wins and losses this year. Utah, Tennessee, and Kentucky in the first month. That is a very tough first month. And Nature Gator will tell you this. Florida's schedule next year is a grizzly bear. Like this team over the course of the next 12 months is going to have to acquire a much higher level of overall talent just to have a chance to keep pace. Next year, Florida plays an improved SEC schedule, and every team in the SEC East that has been in the SEC East will be playing a tougher schedule moving forward because there's a lot of teams in the East that you've been able to feast on in the past, and you won't be able to do that on a yearly basis moving forward. So Florida gets the tougher SEC schedule, and next year they're playing all 3 Power 5 in-state foes. Florida State, of course. They're also playing Miami, and they're playing UCF, which I think is a real game. So the Florida schedule in 2024 is really tough. They have to have a much improved roster ahead of next season. BA's Ty Stone Cold Style says whether or not the ACC's bottom teams are better than the Big Ten's bottom teams. My gut is to say Big Ten probably has a higher overall level of play, I believe. It'd be an interesting thing to do side by side. But I'm thinking of the Purdue's. I'm thinking of the, Indiana hasn't been terrible. Not always good, but they haven't been terrible. They're halfway decent with Michael Penix a couple of years ago. Who's the bottom? Now, the very bottom is like a Rutgers. That's probably as bad as anything in the ACC. But if you go to a team like Maryland, kind of like right there in the middle tier, if Maryland had stayed in the ACC, that would be an upper tier ACC team, and they can't quite crack the middle tier of the Big Ten. That to me is a little bit of an example between the two leagues. All right, we got to go for now. Thanks for being here. Good comments. Sorry about I guess there was some buffering. Sorry about that. But y'all find R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. Showing up on time, doing the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that, including hot week right now. Get your air conditioning unit tuned up to stay cool when the weather gets so hot. Find them online, rsandrews.com. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then.